In April of 1942, a young American soldier named Tenney stood in a column of exhausted men on a dirt road on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, watching a Japanese guard drag a man out of the line just a few yards ahead of him. The man could not walk anymore. His legs had simply stopped working after days without food or water, and everyone in that column already knew, without anyone needing to say it out loud, exactly what came next. Tenney did not look away. He forced himself to watch, because some part of him understood, even in that moment of complete physical and mental exhaustion, that if he survived this, someone needed to remember exactly what happened here. What he was witnessing that afternoon was a single moment inside what would become one of the most brutal atrocities of the entire Pacific War. A 65-mile forced march that killed thousands of men before they ever reached a prison camp, and a camp waiting at the end of it that would turn out to be, in some ways, even deadlier than the road itself. This is the story of what happened to the men who survived the Bataan Death March, and the question almost none of them could answer for the rest of their lives. Why some of them lived when so many others, as standing right beside them, did not. But here is the detail that should stop you before we go any further, because it is the key to everything that follows in this story. The soldier dragged out of that column, the one Tenney forced himself to watch, was not unusual. He was not a rare, isolated case of cruelty in an otherwise orderly prisoner transfer. He was one of thousands. And the surviving men who watched it happen, over and over, mile after mile, for days, carried a specific and haunting question with them for the rest of their lives. One this video is going to answer in full. What, exactly, determined who lived and who did not, when the men falling beside you seemed, in every visible way, no different from you at all? To understand how 60,000 to 80,000 men ended up on that road in April of 1942, you have to understand the desperate military situation that produced them. American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula had been fighting a losing battle for months, cut off from resupply, running critically low on food, ammunition, and medicine, holding out far longer than Japanese planners had originally expected, but with no realistic hope of relief or reinforcement arriving in time. By early April, with his forces starving and combat ineffective, Major General Edward King, commanding the besieged American and Filipino troops on Bataan, made the agonizing decision to surrender, the largest surrender of American forces in the nation's military history up to that point. A decision he made without authorization from his superiors, specifically to prevent the wholesale slaughter he believed continued resistance would produce. What King could not have known, in the moment he surrendered, was that the alternative to slaughter on the battlefield was not safety. It was something almost as deadly, delivered more slowly, over the course of days rather than minutes. King's surrender itself is worth pausing on, because the decision carried enormous personal risk for him specifically. Japanese military culture at this stage of the war regarded surrender as a profound dishonor, and King had no assurance whatsoever about how his own surrender would be received, or how the tens of thousands of men under his command would actually be treated once they laid down their weapons. He walked into that surrender negotiation not knowing whether he was saving his men's lives or delivering them into something worse than the battlefield they were leaving behind. Within days, he would have his answer, and it would be far worse than even his most pessimistic expectations. The Japanese 14th Army, commanded by General Masaharu Homma, had planned for a much smaller number of prisoners than the 60,000 to 80,000 exhausted, starving, and often already sick American and Filipino soldiers who actually surrendered, and this single miscalculation, whether through genuine logistical failure, deliberate cruelty, or some combination of both that historians still debate today, set the stage for the disaster that followed. The prisoners were organized into columns and forced to march roughly 65 miles from the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula to a rail line at San Fernando, under a blazing tropical sun, with Japanese guards providing little to no food, water, or rest along the way. Before we get to exactly how brutal this became, it helps to understand the physical condition of the men who started this march in the first place, because it explains why a 65-mile walk, something an ordinary fit soldier might complete in 2 or 3 days without undue hardship, turned into a death sentence for thousands. These were not fresh troops. They were men who had already been fighting on starvation rations for months, many already suffering from malaria, dysentery, or severe malnutrition before they ever took their first step on the road north. The march did not create their vulnerability. It exploited a vulnerability that had already been building for months of a hopeless, undersupplied siege. Here is the detail that made this march so uniquely horrifying compared to other forced prisoner transfers of the war. It was not simply neglect. Guards along the route beat stragglers who could no longer keep pace, and men who collapsed and could not immediately rise were, in a horrifying number of documented cases, bayoneted, shot, or beheaded where they fell. Their bodies left along the roadside as the column continued forward, forcing the men marching behind them to walk past the evidence of what awaited anyone who could not keep up. Some guards subjected prisoners to what survivors described as deliberately cruel sun treatment, forcing men to sit for hours in direct tropical heat without shade or water, as a form of punishment or simple casual abuse. Filipino civilians who attempted to offer food or water to the passing columns were, in numerous documented instances, driven off or beaten themselves for the attempt, though many still found ways to leave rice or fruit along the roadside for prisoners to grab as they passed. There is one more detail from the march itself that deserves inclusion, because it complicates any simple narrative of universal cruelty from every single guard along the route. Survivor accounts, collected independently over many decades, describe real variation in how individual Japanese guards treated the prisoners under their watch, some enforcing the brutal pace and punishments with what survivors described as genuine and apparently personal cruelty, others showing small, quiet acts of leniency, looking away when a prisoner grabbed food offered by a Filipino civilian, or allowing brief unauthorized rest when a senior officer was not nearby to observe it. This variation does not soften the overall horror of what happened. It does help explain why individual survival often came down to which specific stretch of road and which specific guards a given prisoner happened to pass through on a given day, a grim lottery that had nothing to do with a man's own strength or will to live. By the time the surviving prisoners reached the rail line at San Fernando, the march itself had already killed an estimated several thousand men, a toll that varies across historical estimates, but that consistently runs into the thousands for Filipino prisoners specifically, and several hundred for American prisoners. A difference in survival rate that historians attribute partly to Filipino soldiers' greater familiarity with the tropical climate, and partly to the simple fact that there were vastly more Filipino prisoners in the columns to begin with. But the march's end was not the end of the ordeal. Prisoners were packed into narrow, suffocating metal boxcars for the rail journey to Camp O'Donnell, crammed in standing-room-only conditions so tight that men who died during the journey remained upright, held in place by the press of other bodies around them, unable to fall. Stop and consider what that actually means for a moment. Men who had survived days of forced marching under direct threat of execution, who had watched friends bayoneted along the roadside, who had finally reached what should have been the relative safety of a fixed camp with walls and structure and, presumably, some basic level of organized care, arrived instead at a place that would kill even more of them than the road itself had. And here is the part of this story that surprises people who assume the worst was over once the marching stopped. Camp O'Donnell, the destination waiting at the end of this ordeal, was in many respects deadlier than the road that led to it. It is worth pausing here to sit with just how quickly conditions deteriorated once prisoners actually arrived, because the speed of the collapse tells you something important about how unprepared the entire system was for what had just happened at Bataan. Within the first week alone, the combination of exhausted, already sick men, contaminated water sources, and a camp population several times larger than anything the facility had been designed to hold produced exactly the conditions epidemiologists would predict for a disease outbreak of catastrophic proportions. And that outbreak arrived almost immediately, with dysentery in particular spreading through the camp's population at a rate that outpaced any capacity the camp's overwhelmed and undersupplied medical staff had to respond to it. Camp O'Donnell had been designed, insofar as it had been designed at all, with wholly inadequate sanitation, medical facilities, and food supply for the number of prisoners who actually arrived there. A facility whose planners appear to have made the same catastrophic underestimation of prisoner numbers that had doomed the march itself. Dysentery, malaria, and severe malnutrition spread rapidly through the camp's overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, and in the weeks following the march's conclusion, prisoners died at Camp O'Donnell at a rate that, by some historical estimates, exceeded the death toll of the march itself, with thousands of additional American and Filipino prisoners succumbing to disease and starvation in the camp's first months of operation alone. American medical officers held as prisoners alongside the men they were trying to treat performed what amounted to near miraculous work under conditions that should have made any meaningful medical intervention impossible, improvising treatments from whatever scraps of equipment and medication had survived the surrender and the march, often reduced to nothing more sophisticated than trying to keep dysentery patients hydrated with whatever clean water could be found. A treatment that, however basic, still meant the difference between life and death for men whose bodies had no reserves left to fight the disease unassisted. These prisoner doctors, working without adequate supplies, without proper facilities, and often while suffering from the same starvation and illness afflicting their patients, are remembered in survivor accounts with a specific and lasting gratitude. Men who continued practicing medicine in conditions that offered them every reasonable excuse to simply stop trying. Survivors who lived through both the march and the camp's early months described conditions inside O'Donnell, with a specific, grim consistency across dozens of independently recorded post-war accounts. Burial details working continuously, sometimes burying men who were still alive but too weak to protest or move, because camp medical staff, themselves prisoners with almost no medical supplies to work with, had no reliable way to distinguish a man in the final stages of dysentery-induced unconsciousness from one who had already died. Japanese camp administration provided rice rations so minimal and so lacking in basic nutrients that prisoners developed severe vitamin deficiencies within weeks, conditions that, combined with contaminated water sources and the complete absence of effective sanitation, created exactly the epidemic conditions that would go on to kill thousands more men in the camp's opening months. There is a further, less discussed dimension to the death toll at Camp O'Donnell worth including here, because it shows how the disaster compounded rather than resolved once prisoners reached what should have been a stable, fixed location. Camp administrators, themselves operating under a Japanese military command structure that had drastically underestimated prisoner numbers from the very start of the campaign, had no functioning system for triaging the sick, no reliable medical supply chain, and, in the camp's earliest and deadliest weeks, no established burial protocol capable of keeping pace with the mounting daily death toll. Some historians estimate that in the camp's first 6 weeks of operation alone, deaths among Filipino prisoners specifically climbed into the thousands, a mortality rate so severe that camp administration itself was eventually forced to acknowledge the crisis and begin transferring healthier prisoners to other facilities simply to reduce the catastrophic overcrowding that was accelerating the disease spread in the first place. The question of why some men survived this two-stage ordeal, the march and then the camp, while so many others did not, resists any single satisfying answer. And this is precisely what made the experience so psychologically difficult for survivors to process for the rest of their lives. Some survivors attributed their own survival to specific physical advantages, prior athletic conditioning, particular resistance to the diseases spreading through the camp, or simple, unpredictable luck in which specific guard happened to be watching a given stretch of road on a given day. Others pointed to less tangible factors, a stubborn refusal to give up mentally even as their bodies failed, or small acts of mutual support among groups of men who made informal pacts to help carry or encourage one another through the worst stretches of the march, arrangements that, according to numerous survivor accounts, made a measurable difference in who reached San Fernando alive and who did not. Remember the question this video opened with, what determined who lived and who did not? Here, finally, is the honest answer historians have pieced together from hundreds of survivor accounts. And it is a harder answer than anyone who survived ever really wanted to hear. There was no single formula, no specific skill, no particular strength of character, no reliable habit that guaranteed survival. It was an unstable, shifting combination of prior physical conditioning, chance placement within a given column, the specific temperament of whichever guards happened to be nearby at any given moment, and, in more cases than any survivor was ever fully comfortable admitting, sheer, indifferent luck. This uncertainty is precisely what made the post-war decades so psychologically difficult for the men who lived through it. Survival did not feel earned. It felt arbitrary. And living with that arbitrary quality of your own survival, while friends who had done nothing differently died anyway, is its own particular and lasting form of suffering. Lester Tenney, the soldier whose experience opened this story, survived both the march and Camp O'Donnell, and was later transferred, along with thousands of other surviving prisoners, to forced labor assignments in Japan itself, transported aboard what became known among former prisoners as hell ships, unmarked Japanese transport vessels carrying prisoners in conditions nearly as brutal as the march itself, vessels that, in a bitter and terrible irony, were sometimes torpedoed by American submarines, whose crews had no way of knowing American prisoners were aboard the very ships they were sinking as legitimate wartime targets. The hell ship transports themselves deserve their own moment of attention, because for many Bataan survivors, this later ordeal proved nearly as dangerous as the original march. Conditions aboard these unmarked cargo vessels were, by numerous independent survivor accounts, appallingly similar to the boxcars that had carried prisoners to Camp O'Donnell in the first place. Men packed into airless cargo holds, with almost no food, water, or sanitation, for journeys that could stretch across many days at sea, with disease and suffocation claiming lives even before any external threat arrived. And the external threat was real and specific, because these vessels carried no markings identifying them as prisoner transports. American submarine crews, operating entirely within the normal rules of naval warfare against what appeared to be legitimate Japanese cargo shipping, sank a number of these hell ships without any way of knowing American and Allied prisoners of war were trapped in the holds below, a bitter and largely unavoidable tragedy that added an unknown number of additional deaths to a toll that already defied easy accounting. It is worth noting that the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, however catastrophic in the immediate term, also carried lasting strategic consequences that extended well beyond the individual suffering of the men captured there. The prolonged, months-long defense of the Philippines, though it ended in surrender, had bought the United States critical time in the war's earliest and most vulnerable months, delaying Japanese offensive plans elsewhere in the Pacific and allowing American industrial mobilization additional weeks to begin gathering the momentum that would eventually reverse the war's trajectory entirely. This context does not diminish the horror of what happened to the prisoners afterward, but it is part of the fuller historical picture that survivors themselves, in later decades, often insisted on including whenever their story was told, a determination that their suffering be understood within the full context of what their resistance had actually accomplished for the broader war effort, rather than remembered only as senseless tragedy disconnected from any larger purpose. General Jonathan Wainwright, who took overall command of American forces in the Philippines after General King's surrender at Bataan, and who himself surrendered the remaining garrison at Corregidor weeks later, spent the remainder of the war as a Japanese prisoner, held separately from the men who had endured the death march itself, but sharing in the broader deprivation and uncertainty that defined Japanese captivity throughout the Pacific theater. Wainwright survived his own captivity and was present, in a moment many historians have described as carrying real symbolic weight, at the formal Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in September of 1945. Standing as a living representative of the men who had endured Bataan and its aftermath, at the exact moment the war that had caused their suffering finally, formally ended. General Masaharu Homma, the Japanese commander whose forces conducted the march, was captured after Japan's surrender and tried by an American military tribunal for war crimes, connected directly to the march and its aftermath. A trial in which Homma's defense argued that he had not personally ordered the specific atrocities committed along the route and had limited direct knowledge of conditions at Camp O'Donnell during the period in question. The tribunal rejected this defense, finding Homma responsible as the commanding officer for atrocities committed by forces under his overall command, a legal standard of command responsibility that has since become a significant and frequently cited precedent in international military law. Homma was executed by firing squad in April of 1946, a verdict and sentence that remain debated among historians and legal scholars to this day. Some arguing the tribunal's application of command responsibility was appropriate and necessary, others suggesting Homma became a convenient symbol for atrocities whose specific tactical execution he may not have directly controlled or even been fully aware of as they occurred. The Homma trial itself unfolded amid considerable public and legal controversy that persists among historians to this day. Homma's defense team argued that the specific atrocities along the march route, the beatings, the executions of stragglers, the systematic brutality documented by hundreds of survivors, occurred at a level of tactical execution far below Homma's own direct command attention, carried out by individual guards and lower-level officers without his specific knowledge or explicit orders. The prosecution countered that a commanding general bore responsibility for the conduct of forces under his overall authority, regardless of whether he personally issued each specific brutal order, a legal argument that ultimately prevailed and that established a lasting precedent in international military law regarding command responsibility for war crimes. A legal doctrine still cited and debated in war crimes proceedings held many decades later, involving entirely different conflicts. For the survivors themselves, the post-war decades brought their own distinct and difficult reckoning. Many returned home carrying lasting physical damage from malnutrition and untreated tropical disease that affected their health for the remainder of their lives, alongside psychological scars from an experience that few people outside their own ranks could fully comprehend or discuss with them in any meaningful way, a common and painful experience among survivors of extreme wartime captivity across many conflicts and eras. For decades after the war, many survivors described a specific and painful isolation in trying to communicate what they had experienced to family members, friends, and a broader American public whose understanding of the war rarely extended beyond the general outline of brutal Japanese treatment of prisoners, without the granular, specific detail that survivors themselves carried every day of their lives afterward. Support groups and veterans organizations specifically focused on former Bataan and Corregidor prisoners eventually formed in the post-war decades, providing survivors with a rare community of people who did not need the experience explained to them because they had lived through some version of it themselves. Gatherings that many survivors later described as the only spaces where they felt fully understood without having to translate their experience into terms an outsider could process. Lester Tenney himself became one of the more prominent public voices, advocating for formal recognition of what survivors had endured, publishing a memoir decades after the war, and working for years towards securing an official apology from the Japanese government for the treatment of American prisoners, an effort that saw partial success when representatives of the Japanese government issued formal apologies to American former prisoners of war. In the 2010 decade, more than 6 decades after the march itself had taken place. The Filipino survivors of the march and the camps that followed carry their own distinct and, in some ways, less internationally recognized dimension of this history. The overwhelming majority of the men who suffered and died on that road were Filipino soldiers, fighting in defense of their own home islands alongside their American allies, and the post-war historical record and public memory of the march, particularly outside the Philippines itself, has often centered disproportionately on American survivors' accounts, even though Filipino losses vastly outnumbered American losses at every stage of the ordeal, from the march itself through Camp O'Donnell's deadliest weeks. In more recent decades, historians and Filipino veterans organizations have worked deliberately to correct this imbalance, ensuring that the specific experience and staggering scale of Filipino suffering receives attention proportionate to what actually happened, rather than being treated as a secondary detail within a story more commonly framed around American captivity. The Bataan Death March survivors who lived long enough to see this reckoning were, by that point, a rapidly shrinking group. Elderly men in their 80s and 90s, carrying a specific historical memory that would, within another decade or two, exist only in the written and recorded accounts they left behind, rather than in any living witness who could speak to it directly. Annual commemorative marches, held in the decades since at locations including a well-known memorial event in New Mexico, honoring the men of that state's National Guard unit, who suffered disproportionately heavy losses during the ordeal, given their unit's specific deployment to the Philippines before the war began, have become one of the primary ways this history has been kept alive for generations born long after the war itself ended. Physical reenactments of portions of the original route that draw thousands of participants each year, specifically to ensure the specifics of what happened on that road, are not allowed to fade from public memory the way so many individually experienced wartime atrocities eventually do once their direct survivors are gone. What they left behind, across hundreds of individually recorded post-war interviews and memoirs, is a historical record remarkable for how consistently it describes the same brutal specifics across independently given accounts, a consistency that has made the Bataan Death March one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the entire Pacific War, understood today with a level of detail that few other single events of the conflict can match. 80 years on, the Bataan Death March occupies a specific and somewhat unusual place in how the Pacific War is remembered by the general public, less universally recognized by name than events like Pearl Harbor or the atomic bombings, but arguably better documented in granular, survivor-level detail than almost any other single atrocity of the entire conflict, precisely because so many men survived long enough, and lived long enough afterward, to record exactly what had happened to them in their own words. That documentation is, in the end, the survivors' own final and most lasting act of defiance against what was done to them and to the friends who did not make it home beside them. A refusal to let the specific, granular truth of what happened on that road disappear into vague, generalized wartime horror, insisting instead that history remember the names, the dates, and the details exactly as they happened. If you want to understand not just the march itself, but what happened to the men who survived it, how they lived with an experience that killed so many of the men standing right beside them, and the decades-long fight for acknowledgment that followed. This is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.